Let's go ahead and bring her on. She serves as the legislative director for the National Council on Problem Gambling. Her experience in the nonprofit sector includes a decade of leadership and advocacy, public policy, government affairs, communications, and member relations. She works with Congress and many state legislatures to provide expert advice on gambling policy. She continues to work with stakeholders on both sides of the aisle and state legislatures across the country, which I know, Brianne, is a challenge in today's political environment. Additionally, she has been featured on numerous local, state, national, and international media. And I will say, I just met Brianne face-to-face, of course, in the COVID world via Zoom Friday. And I will say, I didn't need a cup of coffee for the rest of the day coming from a guy who drinks 3 to 4. She's full of energy. And again, she's full of information too. Just in the 30 minutes, 40 minutes that we talked, Brianne, I don't know if you noticed, but I was doing this kind of stuff. I think in our world, it's important to know what you know, but it's also important to know what you don't know. And that's why I'm really excited to hear what you have today to talk on legislation and problem gambling in our world. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Robbie, and thank you for those incredibly kind words. And I couldn't have said it better myself. You know what you know, and there are many things that you don't. And how I continue to grow my skill set is to hear and learn from all of you. So Robbie is absolutely correct. I hope the next 45 minutes here is full of engagement and questions. I'm happy to lecture, but actually I really thrive and really prefer if it's more of a discussion. I want you all to maximize this time and get out of it what you want. There are plenty of slides provided today that you'll have access to afterwards that I'm probably not going to have time to get to, unfortunately. But I am hoping that you will look through them and that you will contact me and we can discuss them if you have any questions thereafter. But without further ado, let's get to it, shall we? If it'll go. So just a little about myself. As Robbie said, I am the legislative director for the National Council on Problem Gambling. We're based in Washington, D.C., although I've been doing gambling policy for 8 years now. And prior to my time, I was lobbying the Small Business Administration. So I have a vast experience working both on Capitol Hill, running a political action committee and lobbying, but also state politics. I came by way of the Mass Council on Compulsive Gambling, where I was their director of policy. So a little about NCPG. I think it's really important to have some context about the organization that I represent every day. So we have a 48-year rich history doing what we do. We are neutral on legalized gambling. What does that mean? It means that we are neither for nor against legalized gambling. It's my job to make sure that any time a state is looking to address gambling, that there is an incorporation and consideration for problem gamblers. And so we aren't going to comment about whether it's good or bad. It's just seriously, if you're going to do this, you have to have considerations to mitigate risk and reduce the harm that can come with it. So we are the sole national advocate for people with gambling problems, which leaves me the tremendous honor of being the voice of the 2% of Americans who often aren't given one. And that means that I engage with all stakeholders around the gambling world. So that's the government, the industry, healthcare providers, like many of you, and then of course, those that are either actively struggling with or a recovery from a gambling disorder. Some key programs and initiatives that NCPG proudly runs as we run the National Problem Gambling Helpline Network. I'll be talking about the calls that we actually get from North Carolina in a little bit. But just to give you a frame of reference, last year we received 201,000 calls, texts, and chats from across the nation. And this year alone, I've already received close to 65,000. Every March, we host National Problem Gambling Awareness Month and quest to, talk more openly about what is problem gambling and gambling disorder to help break the shame and stigma around this. We host an entire month focusing on educating and greater awareness around this important issue. Every December, we have the holiday lottery responsible gambling campaign. We hope you've seen it out there. What we focus on is promoting the fact that tickets are not for children. And there's a responsible way to maybe consider playing the lottery, and that might not include gift giving, especially for children. And then we have something called the Safer Sports Betting Initiative. I spend most of my days talking about this. No surprise, we'll be talking about emerging trends in legislation, and that, of course, the forefront includes sports wagering. And so we have something known as a Safer Sports Betting Initiative. If states are going to legalize sports betting, what considerations do they need to make? And that ties in the national research at the bottom. We did an NGAGE survey. I'm going to share some of those survey results here today with you, talking about the behaviors and attitudes around this and what the gaming industry as well as the government entities need to be considering and responsible for as they embark upon this legalization. And then, of course, we have a few other verification programs and standards that we love to talk about when it comes to legalization. If you're going to legalize gambling, this is the best way to protect the population and consumers at large. And here it is, pretty important stuff, but our sole purpose is to serve as the advocate for programs and services to assist people and families affected by problem gambling, with our mission to improve health and wellness by reducing the personal, social, and economic costs from problem gambling. And it is, again, an amazing privilege to lead both state, national, and global stakeholders in the development of comprehensive policies and programs around problem gambling. And we have 35 affiliate chapters, and we probably have one in North Carolina. If you haven't heard of them, I encourage you to check out their website and learn more about the work that they do. But again, we also have many corporate and industry partners, and then most importantly, sometimes, especially those that are in recovery, are the individual members that we serve every day. Here's some principles that we highlight about the work that we do that inform the decisions that we make and the policy positions that you're going to hear that we take every day. A little bit more. I won't read them all. Nobody likes to be read to by all of their slides. But if you like what I have to say today, or you'd like to learn more about the work that NCPG is doing both in North Carolina and across the world, we are hosting a digital symposium in July. It would have been an in-person conference, but as Robbie pointed out, in wake of COVID, things have changed. So I encourage you all to see what our agenda looks like and maybe come and listen to a session or two, or maybe all of them. All right, so today's agenda, again, I was probably a little ambitious and prepared a lot more, but this is what I'd like to talk about. I'd like to talk about the problem gambling infrastructure that currently exists within the US. What are some emerging trends within legalization of gambling? And then what kind of barriers are we facing both in healthcare policy and legislation and regulation with those emerging trends? COVID has been a game changer, both for legislation and policy. It's also brought about new challenges. It's also brought about some unexpected changes. So I'd like to touch upon that. And then, of course, we'll wrap it up with some final thoughts. Most importantly, is I'd like to structure this, as I said, as a fireside chat. So if I'm talking about things that aren't of interest or going to help you in your practice or your day-to-day life as you approach problem gambling, then let's see it in the chat. I'd much rather you all feel like you took something out of this than heard about things about problem gambling that weren't really relevant. So let's hear from you. I will do my best to get to every question as they come in. And then if I don't get to you, I of course apologize, but I will absolutely follow up with you at the conclusion of the webinar. All right, so some basic facts. We say about 2 million US adults are estimated to meet the criteria for pathological gambling, and about 4 to 6 million are considered to have a problem. Obviously, this varies. That's why research is so important. And we know at the federal level, we have not had a prevalence study, and we've really had to rely upon states to do their own research. We see a huge variability. Take a state like Iowa that's done its own research. We find that they have about 1% of the Iowa population that meets the criteria for a gambling disorder, but they have about 15% of their adult population meeting the criteria for at-risk gamblers. So that would be Iowa. Take a state like New Jersey. Their research indicates that they have about a 6.9% prevalence rate for gambling disorder and about a 14% population meeting the criteria for at-risk. So not all states are created equal, so to speak, depending on how much gambling is within the state, how much money has been invested in mitigating and reducing harm. Also is a factor. There's a lot of considerations here, but I would like to highlight that it's so crucial that you understand what research is available within your state, because there is no one answer. But we do say at large about 2 million and then 4 to 6 million, and anywhere from 8.5% to 14% meeting the criteria for at risk. And with the 2 states I chose to highlight here, you can see that there is a big difference. But we say for North Carolina, about 2.2% of the population, so that's roughly about 172,000 adults that are struggling with a gambling problem. So how is that manifesting? What am I seeing? So I mentioned we run 24/7, 365 confidential helpline. It is a referral service, meaning that we aren't doing the treatment necessarily, but we're going to make sure that the individuals who's in distress or seeking services is able to get connected with someone who can help them. So last year, these are calendar years. As you can see, we've broken it out by month. I received over 1,800 calls, 29 texts, and 35 chats from residents of North Carolina. And this year, we're at 657 already. 12 texts and 2 chats. So while yes, there were 201,000, not an insignificant portion of those calls, texts, and chats are coming right from your backyard in North Carolina. So let's talk a little about what that infrastructure around problem gambling policy looks like here in America. And I'm really sad to say that it's quite tattered and it's highly variable. The total average dollar spent on problem gambling is a very sad 12 cents and 37 cents in the states with funding. And the reason I make that distinction is because there's actually only 40 states that have reported any amount of funding for problem gambling. There are 5 states, those highlighted in green, that have made the investment at over $1. And so this would have said 10 states with 0, right? I said there were 40 that were reporting. I have to say that I've been pleasantly surprised with the legalization of sports wagering. We have seen 2 states and Washington, D.C. remedy their neglect of addressing problem gambling funding through the legalization, meaning Virginia and New Hampshire had once 0, as you can see, they're highlighted in red here, $0 for problem gambling services. New Hampshire, when they authorized sports wagering, not only decided to put $200,000 to problem gambling services, but they also created a responsible gambling fund, a committee or a group that was going to solely address this issue. Virginia, they actually remedied this on 2 fronts. We were quite impressed. Sports wagering, 2.5% of the revenue now will go for problem gambling services, and 0.8% of casinos that are now recently legalized for Virginia will also go to combat problem gambling. So we're really pleasantly surprised to see this progress. On the other hand, we do feel these other 8 states, while they may not have sports wagering, we know that gambling is present and they need to be addressing this in some substantive way. And really what exacerbates this need is the fact that there is 0 federal funding right now for problem gambling. In fact, it's not even just a matter of lack of funding. We don't even actually have an inclusion in the Health and Human Services mandate to even be talking about problem gambling. So why is this an issue? Well, to put it in context, we find, or we know, that substance abuse is 336 times more publicly funded than problem gambling services. Yet, it only has a prevalence rate of 3.8 times greater than problem gambling. So yes, the prevalence is a little bit greater, but not 336 times more 336 more times to warrant that kind of extreme increased funding. So this is what's happening across the nation as far as investment in problem gambling infrastructure, or in lack thereof. But the news kind of gets worse. This is what the federal government is actually making from gambling. So the IRS has collected $7.5 billion from the federal withholding tax on gambling winnings. There's this excise tax on bookmaking generation. And now that we've seen this increase in prevalence of sports wagering, we anticipate this number is only going to increase, and substantially. And then again, of course, not one penny of it is going back to support individuals or states as they face some of these negative consequences that come with legalized gambling. So let's talk a little bit more about where North Carolina lines up. So not the best in news, but you rank 27th. And why you rank 27th is your public investment is a very tiny 10 cents. That means that right now we're seeing about $1 million. It is legislatively mandated, and it goes for the designation for gambling treatment and problem gambling prevention services. The next slide, I'm going to talk about what the state is generating. At NCPG, we say that 1% of all of legalized gambling revenue must be dedicated for problem and responsible gambling. And your 10-cent public investment is a far cry from that 1%. Not only that, let's take the most publicly funded state, Delaware, and their investment is $1.46. So the underfunding of problem gambling service is extreme. And in fact, it's costing North Carolina quite a bit. In fact, there's $135 million right now that the taxpayers are having to carry to families and communities because of gambling-related bankruptcy, divorce, crime, and job loss, all because of this lack of funding. You know, research shows that for every dollar investment in prevention, we can actually reduce the social costs by $2. So getting more funding for problem gambling services is one of our #1 priorities across the nation, but really, as we talk today, for North Carolina. So we know that you have 3 casinos, and they brought in a staggering amount of money, $225.3 million. Yet it's really important to note that there is no statutory funding requirement for problem or responsible gambling in any of your compacts. And while, yes, you're not the only state where I've seen this, there are also many states where the tribes are actually the biggest contributors. In fact, in California, the tribes contribute well over $8 million annually to mitigating the risk and reducing the harm associated with problem gambling. Now, as we pointed out, $1 million does go to the Department of Health to address problem gambling, and that is all earmarked solely from the lottery, which generated $708.3 million, and fiscal year 19, it was their best performing year yet. So that all being said, I know it's a lot of numbers, but if you add it up, we are talking much, much, much smaller than 1% of the total generated revenue from legalized gambling. And of course, it's important to be mindful that none of these numbers are inclusive of the now legalized sports betting that the tribes are allowed to operate in their state. So as we see it, and as I've alluded to, the only way that anyone's going to be able to maximize benefits from legalized gambling is to minimize problem gambling. And it's really important that all facets of what we like to call the problem gambling ecosystem are addressed within policy and within funding. We have to have the research to tell us exactly what the state is facing. Just as I highlighted the differences between Iowa and New Jersey, it's really important for us to understand what's happening in North Carolina. And that can better inform the need and distribution for funding in the other 3 areas. Is more prevention needed? Or is more treatment more pertinent right now? And then what about recovery? Because as you can see on the left, the gambling spectrum really addresses a gambler. There's the recreational gambler, the at-risk, and the problem. And this is never static. People can move about this spectrum depending upon access to gambling, depending on their access to resources and information. And it's really important that we track that and then adapt our approach and our rules and regulations and legislation to make sure we're maximizing the funding we're given to benefit the constituents that we're serving. So as I like to say, if one part of this ecosystem is broken, the whole thing will collapse. Or if one part is neglected in policy, it's really just not going to have the same impact. So when I speak with government officials and I talk about what comprehensive policy looks like, it has to include provisions for all 4 of these domains. So this is a time where I want to do a quick break, see if anybody has any questions. Don't think I'm seeing anything, but like I said before, I'm here and happy to answer them. So, all right, let's talk about some emerging trends. What's happening across the US right now? And surprise, surprise, number 1 on my list, it's sports betting. About 30% of the population right now has access to legalized sports wagering. And that's within their own backyards, right? This isn't even accounting for the fact that a neighboring state might have legalized sports betting. And 12 of those states have approved full-scale online sports betting. And that's a game changer, right? We know that online and mobile comes with its own set of increased risks, and I'm going to talk a little about that. I know it's not something that North Carolina has right now, but I absolutely predict it will be here in the not so distant future. And not only that, just because it's not within your state doesn't mean that people in North Carolina aren't betting on their phones or online and offshore books, or the fact that when they travel, they haven't downloaded the app or engaged or gotten a taste of it elsewhere. So it's really important that we know what kind of increased risk we're seeing with mobile and online sports. And this by far has been the largest expansion of gambling in our nation's history. And it's not just sports betting, but that's what I'd like to focus on right now. So what's going on? So as we've seen the legalization, 30% or 18 states are now up and running. Unfortunately, our research shows 9 of those states did absolutely nothing to dedicate any form of new funding problem gambling services. And I'm sad to report North Carolina was one of those. So according to research, anytime we introduce a new form of gambling or legalized gambling, we're going to simultaneously increase problems. So it's really crucial that any legalization must incorporate new sources of funding. Yes, some funding that already exists is important for consideration, but it doesn't negate the fact that we also were going to face new challenges that require additional dollars. And so here, as you can see, ESPN, we were very grateful, ran an important story about what does sports betting look like in the US 2 years after the Supreme Court had overturned PASPA. And while it's not all bad news, it's not all great news either. So if you'd like to check out more about our thoughts on the issue, I have provided the link to the story here. So what about sports betting in North Carolina? So here it is. This is the bill that authorized it. I thought it was important for you to just see. It was one of the smallest bills that we've seen across the nation, and that's because it was not a huge expansion. It was given solely to the tribes again. But that being said, I don't see that being the end all be all. This doesn't have a consideration for mobile. It doesn't have a consideration for the private sector. It didn't really talk about the access to offshore, which is alive and thriving. And so I don't think this is the end of the discussion about sports betting in North Carolina. But I did want you to have a little glimpse at exactly what the statute authorized. And as you can see, just for those Class 3 gaming, that is the classification for sports wagering. Each form of legalized gambling has its own unique class, but sometimes you will see, and when some of the legislation I'm about to show you, just so everybody knows, sports wagering is considered Class 3. So before we get into what other legislation North Carolina is considering right now, I thought you all should see what the US looks like right now. And as you can see, just as problem gambling policy is all over the place, so is their approach to sports wagering. And so we see around North Carolina, you guys are in solid green, but your neighbor Virginia is also now legalized. You have Tennessee, and you know, not too far away, we're seeing the East Coast and the Midwest also with full-blown legalized and operational sports wagering. So it's really important that you understand the intricacies and nuances, who's attracted to sports wagering, and then a little about their behaviors with sports wagering, and we'll get to that in a couple of slides. So we did this survey. It's called the NGAGE, and it's a survey on the gambling attitudes and experiences around sports wagering because we wanted to know more. This was obviously something that had a very small market because it was illegal. There was only a couple grandfathered states. But all of the news that we had heard in the international sphere wasn't always positive around sports wagering. So we needed to know, well, who's playing? What is their engagement like? Is there increased risk? You know, when we talk about traditional vulnerable populations who may be more predisposed to struggling with a gambling disorder, was that gonna look the same? And in fact, this survey highlighted that it wasn't. And that was really important for me, especially as a policy person, to know, because then I could have more meaningful discussions about what kind of information and resources we were going to need as the industry matured and advanced in states that had never had it before. So we had about 30,000 interviews. Each state was accounted for. And what we really looked at was participation, problematic behaviors, what about positive play, and just what are your beliefs and opinions about problem gambling. And we'd love for you to check out the full report. We definitely didn't have time for that today, but I figured I'd pick out a few of the most salient survey questions. So here's one of the most interesting, especially for me, is what do people think about the government doing more to help people with a gambling addiction? And we found that actually the majority of people were either neutral or agreed that the government needs to be doing more than they are. And then what about the industry? So this is an interesting one. I often find myself in the debate of, oh, you talk to the industry? Should they really have a say in this? And then others feel that because this is coming kind of as a precipice because of their line of work, that they really do have more of a responsibility. But here's what we learned. So it looks like, again, between the neutrality and the agreement, the vast majority of people think that the gaming industry needs to be doing more. And this can be inclusive of a lot of things. Maybe it's just about giving more tools for responsible gambling. Maybe it's being more transparent. We often talk about the importance of an informed consumer. So what are the risks and odds associated with the gaming or recreational entertainment, whatever you want to put on it, term? What am I engaging in? What are the risks? What are the odds? Is this really something that I can be safely doing? So it can look like a variety of different things, but at the end of the day, people say pretty strongly the gaming industry needs to be doing a lot more than they are. And then this, of course, is an interesting one and may catch many of your eyes. What about the services to treat compulsive gambling? Are they even available? So overwhelmingly, and not surprisingly, we see non-gamblers actually are neutral. They're really not sure. And that could be because they're not seeing either the helpline number or some responsible gambling websites or tools that are often promoted within gaming establishments. But as you can see, the gambler is not as well as informed as we think they should be. So this is a great call to action, not only for the gaming industry and public health officials, but also communities at large. Are we talking enough about what services do currently exist and where people can get help? There's often this impression that someone is suffering alone, or that this isn't something that affects the 2% of Americans that we know it does. And so it's really important that we start talking more openly and aggressively about what services do exist, even if they aren't as robust as we would like to see them. So let's look at the problematic gambling activity among sports bettors and why I keep emphasizing the importance of having comprehensive problem gambling policy around sports wagering. And it's because sports bettors actually have almost double the problematic behaviors that all gamblers or non-sports bettors do. As you can see, they're needing to gamble even more for this same thrill. They are relying on others to pay debts or bills at twice the rate of other gamblers. They're lying more than twice that of other gamblers about their behaviors in sports betting, and that they're feeling twice as irritable or restless when they try to stop. Not only did we learn this about their behaviors, we also saw for the first time the demographics of who was being effective by these problematic behaviors was different. So traditionally, we might have seen a young Black male as a more vulnerable individual. I'm going to talk in a little bit about our active duty military and our veterans populations. But when we looked at the demographics of the traditional sports bettor, we actually saw a well-educated, affluent, young white male. And this isn't a demographic that a lot of prevention work had traditionally been focused on. So it's really important, not only do we understand the behaviors, especially the problematic behaviors of a sports bettor, it's also really important to know who those individuals are and what are effective prevention tools to communicating with that demographic. Well, prevention and also treatment and then recovery. So we have to see regulations and approaches change or at least adapt or increase as we see the expansion of sports betting, because it's just not the same as the other forms of legalized gambling that we currently have. So here are some key takeaways. I won't read them all. I think, long story short, this was an incredibly fruitful piece of data. We were really privileged to be able to conduct this. We hope it only continues on. Oh, Yvette, I'm sorry you cannot hear. Is anyone else having that problem?
Yeah, can everybody, this is Robbie. Can everybody hear? Can you hear me, Brianne?
Or see my face? I'm totally gone. Oh,
Can you
and
hear?
George?
Okay. And you can hear me, right, Brianne?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah,
I'm so
yeah.
sorry of that. Oh,
Okay.
no.
Everybody, well, we've got some other feedback. Everybody's saying they can hear.
Okay.
So
All right.
whoever, yeah, lost their volume, maybe check your system there to see. Yep. Okay, I'll go back into darkness.
No, it's okay. Thanks.
I know, all right.
All right. So I'm really sorry, Yvette. I hope you're able to join back in soon. All right. So some other emerging trends, because sports betting is not it. We are seeing the nation's largest expansion of gambling in our history, and it's coming in many forms. I'm seeing a ton of bills addressing pull tabs, bingo, iLottery, online gaming, online poker, you name it, we're seeing it right now. And it's coming at a rapid pace. In fact, we're even seeing it get slid into things without much debate. I think COVID has exacerbated a lot of that. A lot of states, no surprise, are facing enormous budget cuts, and they often are seeing gambling or new forms of gambling as a way to remedy those budget shortcomings. And unfortunately, it's coming at a great expense to the constituents of that state because they aren't making sound considerations for problem or responsible gambling. They're almost too blinded by the allure of additional funds. So I highlighted just a few of the staggering, not so great trends that I'm seeing. The first being your neighboring state of Virginia and my home. So we did see the legalization and authorization of casinos and sports wagering just a few months ago. These were, in fact, not unexpected. They were last legislative session discussion topics. Some research was conducted about what that market would look like and the consequences, both good and bad, were they to come to the state. No surprise, we were expecting the governor to sign them into legislation. What we weren't expecting was the night before, we were anticipating that skill-based games or these, they almost look like slot machines, but you would find them in your local gas station or pub. They were set to actually be made illegal. And unfortunately, at the 11th hour, the governor reversed his opinion and sent back to the legislature actually a consideration that they would now be legal and heavily taxed for a year. But this meant that there were no provisions or safeguards around problem or responsible gambling. I saw this happen in Missouri as well. A simple budget meeting to talk about the next fiscal year actually got 300 video lottery terminals put in truck stops thrown in at the 11th hour again to make up for some of these COVID shortcomings. And Ohio right now is actually considering a video gaming terminal being placed, actually many of them in every VFW hall to make up for their shortcomings of the budget. So while, yes, emerging trends are all over the map and we're seeing lots of debate and discourse around new legalized forms of gambling, we're also seeing this trend that states are so desperate that they aren't actually having robust debates and discussions about how to be prudent to mitigate the risks that come with expansion, and they're doing it in fear and out of necessity for their shortcomings in budgets from COVID. So the trends, again, all not great, and also not always allowing for that kind of policy debate that's really required to consider all sides of the debate. So this is what my day looks like. About every day I follow about 1,500 pieces of filed legislation. I have a breakdown here. About 1,100 of them include those other forms of gambling that aren't sports or daily fantasy. And then I'm proud to say, although I really wish the slice of the pie was much bigger, about 95 or 6% of them have inclusions for problem gambling. But it's really my job and my goal to make sure that every bill that's being considered for gambling also has a consideration for problem and responsible gambling. And here's a breakdown of all 50 states, and I just thought it would be interesting. We're going to talk a little about North Carolina. You have about 19 bills right now that I watch daily. And here are some of them. So as you can see, a few of them are trying to do exactly what I was talking about, which was bring back sports wagering, see if maybe we can get some more out of it. There's also talking about machines, defining what's considered legal or illegal. Just as Virginia was tackling those skill-based games, North Carolina has someone who's looking to do the same. We see some electronic sweepstakes. So the gambling discussion is alive and well. And you didn't think we were done yet, did you? So here we go. We've got some more that talks about pari-mutuel betting. There's now a bill that wants to clarify it's a felony offense to possess a sweepstake machine. So what are the repercussions if you are found to hold some gambling machine that is not considered legal? And then we move over to what I'm working on in the US and the federal side. We're going to talk a little about that. We've got the National Defense Authorization Act, and then we have a few bills that are talking about federal barriers right now with regard to offering mobile sports wagering on tribal lands. And then we have something known as the GAP Act, which I'm going to talk a little about, but I just wanted you to see what it is that I am looking at daily, both on the state side and the federal. But what's happening at the federal level? So I talked a lot about gambling in North Carolina, but I think it's important for you all to know that the DOD is also promoting gambling. And in fact, they currently operate about 3,141 slot machines on bases across the world. And individuals who would have access to this would be your officers and enlisted personnel and their dependents. They are often found within recreational officers' clubs. And the news only gets a little bit more jarring. It brings in about $538 million in revenue annually, made solely from our men and women in uniform. And I find this incredibly pertinent, not only to talk about far and wide, because many people don't realize what the DOD is doing, but also because in North Carolina, no surprise, there is a very large population of active duty military and vets. And I think oftentimes people don't realize what kind of access our military had or currently have to gambling installations. And in fact, it might be what they're encouraged to do because they don't really have access to other recreational activities when they're stationed abroad. So let's talk a little about that. Gambling addiction in the military and why I've been aggressively addressing this on Capitol Hill. So it affects about 2% of our military, which has us at an estimate of about 56,000 active duty personnel that are currently struggling with a gambling disorder. And just like it is in the general population, the prevalence of gambling disorder in the military is a serious health and financial issue. But it takes it a step further because it really does pose a national security concern. And we're really worried about not only harming the individual, but also the readiness and human performance of our servicemen and women. So what's going on in North Carolina? Why did I want to bring this up? So not only is our active duty struggling with this, so are our veterans. No surprise, right? When they get out of the military, it might only be, their problem may only be exacerbated. And right now, we are finding that a third of veterans have gambled and a staggering 6% would be considered to be a problem gambler. And in North Carolina, you have 724,000 veterans. So this is something that has probably disproportionately affected people of North Carolina. So your prevalence data is likely to be even higher than that 2% given the makeup of your state. So what are we doing about all of this? So the first thing to note is that for many years, the government has not actively screened for gambling disorder in the military, although every year they screen for a plethora of other things. So we're proud to say that in fiscal year 19 and the National Defense Authorization Act, it was signed into law that now the DoD and DHS are supposed to start systematically screening our men and women in uniform for gambling disorder. I am sad to report that this has yet actually come to fruition, and we have not seen this incorporated, so we are following up, and they are required to do so. Unfortunately, I wish it was just as simple as the law says so, but this was a tremendous first step to getting a better idea of how many men and women are really struggling. But we didn't think that was enough, right? It's a good start, but I was proud to say that in July of 2019, we filed a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation that aims to kind of address this very issue of gambling disorder within the military. And it has 3 sections. And as you can see here, the first was to make sure that there were policies to address gambling disorder in the military. Right now, they pretty much pretend it doesn't exist. And if you present with an issue, there's no requirement to assist a service member to get help. They could discharge you. So we really wanted to make sure that there were at least clear delineated policies about how this was going to be handled. We wanted to make sure that a list of resources and materials were provided to members who do come forth and say that they're struggling, especially if the DoD is going to operate gambling machines. The least they can do, like many of the states here that have legalized gambling, was to make sure men and women had access to help. And then we wanted to make sure that within 180 days that all the regulations, instructions, and other guidance were updated. Now, what we did is we took this 3rd section and we copied it into the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020. And we had hoped that we would get at least that portion of the GAP Act signed into law. I'm tremendously sad to report that unfortunately it was taken out at the 11th hour, and we had made it from the House over to the Senate, from the Senate back over to the House, where they went into conference committee. And it was quite surprising and quite unfortunate to learn that it never actually made it through. But it is really important to note that precedence is everything, and having individuals like Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Daines of Montana talking about this and filing it, we aren't over. The fight's, it's not done, it's just begun. And we hope to go back. We were hoping to refile in April of this year, and then COVID happened. But the fight will go on, and we're gonna need everyone's help because we will refile. Here are some quotes about why this is so important to the 2 senators. And I mentioned it was bicameral, right? So, and Susie Lee of Nevada was also with us on the House side. So we are going to come back for more when things calm down with COVID and we're able to address other areas of concern. And I am really excited to work with these 3 individuals. I'm really proud to say that this is a very important item for them. So, let's see. Oh, Yvette, it looks like you're still having problems. I'm so sorry. But I think this might be a good place to stop and see if anybody has some questions around what's happening in North Carolina, what's happening across the nation, and what's happening in my favorite, but incredibly crazy city right now of Washington, D.C.
Great stuff, Brianne. Thank you very much. And Yvette, I hope you can hear. Can everybody else hear? I got some feedback 10 minutes ago or so that everybody could hear, but Yvette, again, we apologize for any difficulties, technical difficulties that that you might be experiencing. But I've got a question, if I may, and it's just a general question.
Sure.
That's tied to, Brianne, sports gambling, and I really loved how you positioned it. Oh, thank you. I really loved how you positioned the legalization of sports gambling and how it's, coming across the nation now as perhaps it might be an opportunity for folks that work in the field, right? So with saying that, once this thing perhaps gets traction and things happen like we're saying they perhaps will, with people being more at risk and some more things that might come about, do you see things like the GAP Act being affected from sports gambling? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Do you see
absolutely.
an
There's
effect there?
always a correlation. I see this reinvigoration of discussion of all things gambling as an opportunity for us to highlight maybe some of the other not good things, like all of the lack of funding across the nation, or those vulnerable populations that really haven't been addressed, like individuals in the military or our vets. I absolutely see any time the opportunity for gambling discussions to absolutely utilize that to talk about the necessity, for more comprehensive problem gambling policies. Again, I think that the cost could be far greater if we don't use this opportunity to talk about problem gambling. It's only going to be exacerbated. So yeah, I love to now people who may have not thought about gambling or cared about slot machines on the bases. You want to talk about sports betting? Great. Let's also talk about all the other forms of gambling that are happening and how can we address this all at once. So yeah, absolutely. That's a great question.
Thank you.
Let's see. Anyone else?
And I've got one more 101 question about sources, if you don't mind.
No, not at
Going
all.
back a few slides, you talked about when there's a new form of gambling that comes about, like sports gambling, that you also see new sources of funding along with existing sources. Can you give us an example of something that might be a new form of like a source of funding?
Sure. So a new source of gambling would be Tennessee, for instance. When they had legalized sports wagering, they have a 20% tax on the operators for the privilege of getting a license. And 5% of that tax is earmarked to address problem and responsible gambling. So it's not necessarily coming from maybe the general fund in the state, but it's a tax, or at least a portion of the tax that the state may have taken for themselves, that's now protected and appropriated solely for problem and responsible gambling.
Makes sense.
Does that make sense? So, as we talk to stakeholders across the nation, we talk about diversified funding. And I think that's really important to highlight here, because given what's happened with COVID, states are hurting in a tremendous way, right? Yeah. So problem gambling funding came solely from the states. Like many other state-funded programs, there's going to have to be a cut to that. And so making sure that problem gambling services has diversified sources of funding, meaning from private stakeholders, from public entities, it's really important. That way services can continue forward even amid something like a crisis like COVID. So it can be difficult for states. That's why each state is so unique. It depends how they structure themselves. But I hope that answers it. Tennessee needed to find another way to generate revenue, and a portion of the tax was just delineated for problem and responsible gambling.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Well,
And you
like I
guys,
said, I
yeah,
have a ton more content, right? But you're 2 minutes to the hour.
yeah,
So I'm hoping what we can do is distribute my slides, because what I tackle next is about COVID and about cashless wagering, which is what we're seeing as an emerging trend now, where casinos are actually looking to move from a cash-based system to cashless, to help consumers be a little bit more protected from dirty cash. But that comes with a risk, a tremendous risk. And given that the makeup of consumers have changed in light of COVID as well, we have some additional concerns. So I go through and I highlight what each of those increased risks are, and how we can mitigate that risk through some emergency regulations. So I encourage you all to take a look and see what it is that the nation is facing, and how we might be able to address those head on right now.
yep. Wonderful, Brianne, and thank you very much. We are just probably a few seconds at the hour, so
Yeah.
we do want to thank everybody for being on, who's been on. And this has been really some great information, and I really like the NGAGE information you gave us too from that study. Very interesting, and it was great stuff to see. So does anybody else have any other questions before our hour is actually up now? But do you have any questions? And while I say that, as Brianne said, we will have these slides on the UNC Behavioral Health website and the recorded version as well. So
I'm trying to find my contact information. It's
cool.
all the way at the end, sorry. But there's my information. I hope you enjoyed today. I hope you learned something new. But please don't be shy. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to know what more I could have shared, what more you want to know. And like we said at the onset, I continue to grow and learn from hearing from all of you. So thank you for your time today. I really appreciated this.
Yep. Thank you, Brianne. And thank you for everybody who was on. And our next webinar will be June 30th at noon. Dr. Lori Rugel will present on gambling in the family. So, okay. Thank you very much. And thanks again, Brianne. Great stuff.
Thanks.
All right, everybody have a great day, a great week. Bye-bye.